action plans to address temperature impairments in the Mattole, Navarro, and Eel River watersheds. So I will, Matt, are you the lead on this?
Good, yes. Almost a few minutes from afternoon. I'm Matt St. John, Executive Officer at the North Coast Regional Board.
Would you introduce your staff?
And I'm pleased to introduce...
would all of those who are chatting in the back chat outside, please? We're continuing our meeting.
Thank you. To my right is Brian McFadden, Senior Water Resources Control Engineer and the Project Manager for this Basin Plan Amendment, and he will be giving the staff presentation. Samantha Olson is our Senior Staff Counsel, and to my left is Jeremiah Puget, Environmental Scientist. I'll turn it over to Brian.
Where it says push. Well, good day, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and other members of the board. For the record, I'm Brian McFadden, the Regional Water Board staff, and I'm here to present for your consideration the North Coast Regional Water Board's policy for the implementation of the water quality objectives for temperature and action plans to address temperature impairment in the Mattole, Navarro, and Eel River watersheds. The topics I'll discuss today include the purpose, overview, approach of the policy, some discussion of the TMDL action plans, and public review comments. This item is an amendment to the North Coast Basin Plan. It builds on Resolution R1 2012-0013, which we call the policy statement for implementation of the water quality objectives for temperature in the North Coast region. And that resolution spells out in considerable detail the regional boards, the North Coast board's approach to addressing temperature impairments and implementing the objectives. It takes the same or similar approach as the North Coast board's sediment TMDL implementation policy, and it's consistent with the statewide non-point source policy. The purpose of the policy is to explicitly identify shade as a controllable water quality factor, to incorporate a program of implementation to address existing temperature impairments and to address further temperature impairment, and to meet the terms of a stipulated agreement that calls for the development of a region-wide policy for temperature and 3 standalone action plans for the Mattole, Navarro, and Eel. This agreement settled challenges the state and regional board to develop implementation plans for TMDLs established by the US EPA without formal implementation plans. As an overview, the policy identifies the activities that can elevate water temperatures and describes the tools that are available to the regional board to address those impacts all in one place. We like to call this the toolbox approach. It directs temperature issues be addressed on a site-specific basis in the context of permits, enforcement, grants, other tools. And the scope is broad and larger than the regional board's implementing authority, and includes coordination with and actions by other agencies with authority to address factors outside the board's implementation authority. And it incorporates and formally describes a program of temperature implementation into the Basin Plan. The approach is to focus on temperature factors that are associated with shade, sediment, and flow, and again, using existing regulatory tools and opportunities. Now I'd like to summarize the specific actions that are contained in the policy. This policy directs the regional board to restore and maintain site-specific potential effective shade conditions using available tools as appropriate, It directs the regional board to control sediment discharges consistent with the sediment TMDL implementation policy. It directs the board to address temperature issues in the development of non-point source programs, and permits, as well as individual and general permits, and to use other regulatory executive enforcement tools as appropriate. The policy directs the board to support and encourage restoration projects that address temperature through the use of grant funds and other non-regulatory actions. And as I mentioned, the scope is broad and addresses factors outside the regional board's implementation authority, and accordingly, the policy directs the regional board to continue to coordinate with the Division of Water Rights in the permitting and licensing process, as well as coordination with the division on the development of in-stream flow studies and flow objectives where that's appropriate. The policy directs the regional board to provide guidance and recommendations to other agencies, and particularly directs the regional board to work with local governments with land use planning authority to develop strategies to address elevated water temperatures. It also directs the regional board to collaborate with the state board on the development of statewide policies to address temperature concerns. And finally, it directs the board to develop and implement a region-wide water temperature trend monitoring program, as well as develop and maintain a temperature implementation work plan. And that work plan would define specific actions that are appropriate for specific watersheds. It's meant to be a living document that facilitates adaptive management. In regards to the action plans to address elevated water temperatures in the Mattole, Navarro, and Eel River watersheds, these are 3 standalone action plans, as was agreed to in the stipulated agreement I referred to. There are 3 action plans, but they actually address 8 TMDLs because the Eel River watershed action plan addresses 6 sub-basin TMDLs. The action plans are consistent with the regional policy, yet they contain more specificity than the policy. And the way I describe this is that the action plans translate the concepts that are described in the regional policy to the specific needs and issues that are present in these 3 watersheds. Those action plans include permitting programs that are in place or in development that address temperature impairments, as well as non-regulatory actions that would support proactive efforts to address temperature. The action plans also direct the regional board to develop in-stream flow studies as appropriate, and of course coordinate with the Division of Water Rights. In regards to the public comments that were received on this item, there were 5 comment letters submitted, and all the comments have been responded to. The response to comments are posted on the board's agenda page. And the main comments that we received can be summarized as the reasonableness and burdens and costs to the regulated community, the regulation of controllable water quality factors, adequacy of the science involved and behind the policy, and CEQA analysis and economic considerations. I'll go through each of these. In regard to the regulatory burden, we want to point out that site-specific potential effective shade is a general concept. It's not a prescriptive standard. And in fact, there are no prescriptive standards that are promulgated by this policy. Specific temperature requirements will be developed, if they aren't already, in a site or activity-specific public process for a given for permits developed for a given activity. And other relevant factors will be evaluated in determining appropriate shade controls at that time. And that would include the things like technical considerations like the geometry, geography, and magnitude of impacts, as well as the reasonability of any requirements. In regard to the regulation of controllable factors, I mentioned that the Regional Board's planning authority is broader than its implementation authority, and that's demonstrated by the broad scope of actions in coordination with other agencies. And the policy properly addresses these limits. The Regional Board may condition controllable water quality factors associated with land use activities that discharge waste. And Section 13263 of the Water Code provides that waste discharge requirements implement the basin plan. It's also important to note that controls on shade are often also effective at controlling discharges of sediment, nutrients, and other pollutants. In regards to the adequacy of the science, we maintain that the scientific discussion in the staff report is extensive and that the cited papers support the basis of the policy. Given that this is a basin plan amendment, of course, it's been through scientific peer review and all the comments from the peer reviewers have been addressed. And the Regional Board considered and incorporated additional science that was provided by stakeholders, including findings from CAL FIRE's scientific literature review that supported the development of their anadromous cell-mounted protection rules. In regards to the CEQA analysis and economic considerations, there were several comments asking for more detailed analysis. However, the level of detail provided is consistent with the scope of this programmatic document and policy. Recall the discussion on regulatory burden that there will be additional review and public process in any site or activity-specific context. We also received comments objecting to analysis outside of, on matters outside the board's implementing authority. And the Regional Board recognizes its limits of authority and identifies them in the policy, but the CEQA analysis is broad and recognizes possible actions by other agencies. So thus, disclosing impacts of actions by other agencies is appropriate. Other comments address the scope of the economic analysis, and the economic considerations are appropriate for the programmatic scale of this policy. That concludes my presentation, and I ask you to approve this Basin Plan amendment to the North Coast Basin Plan, establishing a policy for the implementation of the water quality objectives for temperature and the 3 action plans for the Mattole, Navarro, and Eel River watershed. I'm eager to hear your comments and would be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Shall we go ahead and take the one card I have and then ask questions? Okay. Carrie Fisher.
Good afternoon, Carrie Fisher from the California Farm Bureau Federation. I'm actually speaking on behalf of not only the California Farm Bureau Federation today, but also Forest Landowners of California, Sonoma County Farm Bureau, California Cattlemen's Association, Mendocino County Farm Bureau, Buckeye Conservancy, California Licensed Foresters Association, and Humboldt County Farm Bureau. I'm going to do it all so you don't have to hear it multiple times from everyone else. So we just want to, I'm going to make this brief because I'm sure everyone's really hungry. We want to reiterate our comments in our letter that not only we initially submitted to the Regional Board that were not addressed, but then also submitted to you guys. And the overarching comment that we have specifically deals with a jurisdictional misinterpretation of the toolbox, as Brian McFadden alluded to, that they have this toolbox to implement this policy, and we see a jurisdictional misinterpretation of the Regional Board's authority, which will become a fundamental problem since it will be in the Basin Plan, and all subsequent regulations or permits will have to be consistent with the Basin Plan. And that fundamentally is that heat from sunlight is not a waste. And although the temperature policy does acknowledge it, it then goes on to say they will use their authority to prescribe waste discharge requirements under 13263, but the fundamental issue is to do a waste discharge requirement, you have to be regulating waste. The policy specifically says heat from sunlight is not a waste. So we have this conflict that will be a fundamental conflict when the policy is actually put to use, when there is a subsequent regulation or waste discharge requirement or some sort of program. So we have this conflict that we see will arise later on, and so that's why we had asked that this issue actually be remanded back to the regional board so that we can get rid of this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from Steve? Go ahead.
No, thank you for the presentation and the and bringing up this point about the jurisdiction and grappling with what affects temperature and meeting temperature standards. So I wanted to get back to this concept that you've brought forward, the site-specific potential effective shade idea and principle. Do you have tools that are available, either GIS or technical tools yourselves or stakeholders that you work with that could use a concept like this to set goals through a collaborative process for attaining temperature?
Yes, there are a number of tools available, you know, public domain models. You know, it's something that can be evaluated in the field as well.
And so that would be, yeah, and so those type of tools can kind of help the planning process in terms of watershed planning, collaborative work, to set what you might say are attainable targets.
Yeah, and I also want to acknowledge that we're working on a tool with the San Francisco Estuary Institute that does exactly what you're talking about, which would be widely available and hopefully a relatively easy tool to apply at any watershed scale.
I'm searching for, you know, kind of the utility of the concept as opposed to just the hard-nosed regulatory application. Would it be fair to say, you know, you've been careful to describe the settings, I think, where this would be brought into the discussion, the implementation. And would you say in practice, you know, you would be working with existing WDRs, you know, existing type regulatory programs, and that rather than being a burden or a requirement, you know, a priori, it would be maybe a pathway to enable the permittee to have regulatory credit for investing in, you know, shade and riparian restoration, which has all these other benefits. I mean, you know, so that is, in practice, it's not really, you need to meet this site-specific shade. It's more that, you know, it's one of the many things that you're already regulating, and it would be a part of the overall watershed management approach that you'd want to say that makes you in compliance.
Yeah, and that's consistent with the way that these things are implemented. I would point to our timber regulatory program, which regularly addresses riparian buffers to address not only shade, but large woody debris, sediment discharges, nutrient discharges, those sorts of things. Habitat for terrestrials, which is outside our wheelhouse, but a number of issues, sure.
And then it's also, we're hearing from the Farm Bureau, so these are probably new concepts in the agricultural setting as opposed to the timber setting. Would that be fair to say in the North Coast region?
I think that's fair to say. Outside of watersheds that have already had temperature TMDL implementation plans developed, like in the Klamath, Scott, and Shasta watersheds, where we're already implementing this approach. But outside of those areas, yeah, it's a new concept. Yeah.
Questions?
I mean, obviously, I appreciate the comment made by the Farm Bureau. I also want to acknowledge that the response to comment covered that particular concern that was raised quite extensively and thoroughly, covering some of the points that Board Member Moore raised, as well as, at least when I read it, what struck out at me, in addition to what Member Moore raised, was that while the Regional Board acknowledged that heat is not a waste, it is recognized as a pollutant under federal law, and it is something that is within the authority and purview, and actually is mandated in terms of achieving our beneficial use protection mission. So I'm appreciate the concern, but I think that concern has been adequately responded to. In any case, I know
I wanted to, Dee Dee had some comments that she wanted to make.
I was about to make a motion, but I will.
Well, I spent some time on this with staff and do appreciate the opportunity to hear their approaches along the lines of what Board Member Moore was talking about, the coordinated approach using existing tools, non-regulatory, also regulatory, that are already, in existence. And so Ms. Olson was nice enough to pull together a few. Do you have the email that you sent me by any chance? She was nice enough to pull together a couple of areas in the resolution adopting the Basin Plan, and then in the Basin Plan amendment as well. And maybe if you could first go over what's already in the Basin Plan. Do you have that information? I have it here. I could read it if you want.
Certainly, if you have it. I mean, in the Basin Plan itself, it reserves the authority. There was a lot of consternation over the specific site potential effective shade and whether that was a prescriptive target or standard, or how that gets translated in a permit. So you'll find various locations in the Basin Plan itself and the adopting resolutions that talk about how that's a guidance, it's sort of scientific guidance. But at the end of the day, these are going to be translated into our non-point source permits, which are management-based. And so in the Basin Plan itself, it just says this policy in no way limits the state board or regional board's authority and discretion to develop riparian management measures and other measures as appropriate and necessary for a specific land use activity, geographic area, and in consideration of existing regulatory and non-regulatory programs in place. I mean, that's what's in the actual Basin Plan, and there are several other areas in the adopting resolution and the policy statement that also talk about this transition and this translation that's going to happen in a further site-specific or activity-specific process.
Right, and so I don't know that this would necessarily make a difference to Farm Bureau, because it's a different view. So I don't know that this language would be helpful at this point. I had asked for some resolution language to just tie this all together and clarifying that all the different conditions and factors would be considered in any approach. But I'm seeing, Ms. Fisher, it doesn't really seem to make much of a difference because you just have a different view about our authority.
Right, and I don't have any opposition against this being improved. Our issue, it's a very nuanced issue, and they have the authority under the Clean Water Act in their TMDLs, which are using the Clean Water Act authority and they have done this where they've looked at shade and heat. And our issue is when you're not doing a TMDL and you're solely relying on Port or Cologne's authority to do a waste discharge requirement or something, and you're trying to rope in heat without using the Clean Water Act. So it's a very nuanced issue, and that's why we're talking about its use in the future.
Phil, do you want to comment?
Sure. So part of, I think, the problem is that we're talking about a general provision that's for the regional board's Basin Plan. We're not yet seeing exactly how the regional board plans to implement it. And I think there's no question that even solely under state law, that the temperature impacts from reducing riparian shade are a water quality factor, and that the regional boards and the state board have jurisdiction over water quality factors, at least with respect to coordinating with other agencies. Certainly with respect to, as Board Member Moore, I think, was suggesting, building in trade-offs. We definitely have for years now had in place in some watersheds provisions that allowed for relaxation of some regulation in terms of sediment discharges if the landowner was willing to maintain greater riparian buffer zones, for example. So I do appreciate Ms. Fisher's point that there may be, and there are some limits to the regional board's ability to directly regulate under the Porter-Cologne Act, but we're not at a point right now where we are looking at any particular waste discharge requirements or waiver of waste discharge requirements to evaluate whether the regional board is bumping up against the limits of their authority. Frankly, I think it's conceivable that a regional board could overstep its authority, but we're just not in a position to judge today whether that could happen. And there's nothing wrong with the provisions in the basin plan. It's really a question of how they'll be implemented in the future.
So are we ready for a resolution?
Yeah,
Before
I think in light of that discussion, I don't see that this language really adds anything. It restates current law, so I'd be fine with just moving forward without it. Thank you.
Oh, you may.
With the Vice Chair's permission, I now move for adoption of this item.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. We will recess until, what do you say, 1 o'clock or 1:15? 1:15. Okay, we will recess until 1:15, and then we will resume.
Thank you very much, Board.